join me in a very warm welcome for Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Executive Director of the Atlantic Council.
Well, thank you so much. If I had known there was pizza, I would have said yes much earlier. Well, thank you so much, first and foremost, Ambassador Stevenson, for the warm welcome and your kind words. I've had the great fortune of working with a number of American ambassadors throughout my career. Ambassador Stevenson is just a gem, a wonderful person, deeply accomplished, and I think you've also seen in your own experience working with her, somebody who really cares about you as a person, which is so critically important for our diplomacy and for your own development. So thank you, Ambassador Stevenson, for that welcome and for hosting me here. It's great to be here with all of you. I wanted to share at the beginning this video that we produced as part of the NATO summit to give you some of the story of how the council came together and which has informed my work and the worldview and how we engage. So the council is a nonpartisan organization that galvanizes U.S. leadership and engagement in the world in partnership with allies and its partners to shape solutions to global challenges. So we don't do it alone. Driven by our mission of shaping the global future together, we promote constructive leadership on the international stage and provide an essential forum to navigate the economic, political, and security challenges that really have come to define the 21st century. And so we bring together folks from all over the world to shape the conversation through convening power. We host 900 events a year, bringing together officials, thought leaders from across the world to discuss the most pressing challenges on the international stage. We also influence the field by publishing cutting-edge research, reports, and short-form pieces. The council has 16 programs and centers that I lead that cover a series of regional and functional issues ranging from U.S. relations and Africa to harnessing the power of emerging and disruptive technologies. We're truly a global organization. I can tell you that from the smells in the cafeteria around lunchtime. Not always a good thing. But if there is a major political issue, a geopolitical issue that is happening in the world that you're interested in, chances are you can find it at the Atlantic Council. Somebody smart is working on it. But for today's conversation, I really want to focus on the defining issue at the heart of the Council's creation, which remains central to our ongoing mission today, and that's transatlantic security. And really how the United States works with our European allies to promote a shared set of values and interests. So the Council, as you saw briefly, was founded in '61 by former Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and Christian Herter. They served in that capacity during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, one Democrat, one Republican, in the early years of the Cold War, as the collective West came together to configure a new post-war international order. So one of the institutions set up during this period and signed into existence by Secretary Acheson in 1949 was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Secretary Acheson was just 21 when the First World War broke out. How many of you are 21 in this room? I mean, think about it. Think about what it meant for Acheson to be your age at that moment in history, because you're living history now. And so his generation came at age of a time when old uncertainties of 19th century imperial power collapsed. Sounding familiar? They experienced the horrors of the First World War and saw how efforts to create a post-war order by punishing the defeated party gave rise to extremist ideologies. Fascism, communism, World War II, and the Holocaust. Their generation had absorbed the lessons of previous failures. And with the new threats posed by the Soviet Union, they determined that the best way to avoid history from repeating itself required a greater transatlantic community to really bind together through a web of shared institutions designed to promote our common liberty, prosperity, and security. So NATO was their answer to this question of collective security. And in April of 1949, 12 countries, many of whom had twice been enemies in their own living memory, came together to agree that an attack on any one of them constituted an attack on all of them. And it was through this reinforcing sense of trust and obligation, of shared values and shared interests, that NATO would become the most successful and durable political military alliance in history. And in the 75 years that followed, the alliance prevailed for the most part in the Cold War, welcoming 20 additional allies and ushered in a decades-long peace dividend in Europe that allowed the continent to rebuild from the ruins of World War II into the strongest bloc today. And of course, I would also humbly suggest that these visionaries also created the Atlantic Council to act as a powerful, nonpartisan champion of a world order that advances personal freedom, democracy, peace, and security to strengthen alliances that serve as force multipliers in this endeavor, because states alone, treaties alone, do not a commitment make. And this continues to be the guiding purpose of the Council today. So it goes without saying that a lot has changed in the world since the Council was founded, and it's changed not just since the end of the Cold War or since 9/11 or even since COVID. Many of the conclusions that we took from winning the Cold War, that we were in this post-history age where democracy would spread irresistibly around the world, has been dashed. And far from integrating into Western institutions, Vladimir Putin's Russia harbors revanchist ambitions to relitigate the end of the Cold War and to reconstitute the Soviet Empire at Europe's expense. And he's doing so with no thought to the human cost that he's inflicting. His appalling crimes against the Ukrainian people recall some of the darkest days of the 21st century. But beyond Ukraine, Putin continues to target NATO allies through a campaign of hybrid or so-called gray zone warfare tactics, because these are acts that are just shy of traditional kinetic warfare. These include cyber attacks, assassination plots, and attacks on critical infrastructure, such as severing undersea cables. Commercial flights in Finland have been grounded because of the echoes of GPS scrambling that can imperil safe air travel. And this quiet war of Russian attacks against a host of NATO countries exists alongside Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, but it has helped it to endure because it attrits that capability and exacts a cost on countries that is borne broadly across their societies. So that too is happening in the background. That's because Vladimir Putin's war is not just against Ukraine, it's against everyone who believes in a world in which sovereign states are free to determine their own paths. The horrific cost of war in Ukraine is more visible, but we must remember that this isn't an assault against just one nation or even many across NATO. It's an assault on principles of sovereignty, on democracy and the rule of law, and the right of citizens to self-determination, and the ideals that underpin the world order that has delivered security to the US and our allies for decades. So we must remain steadfast in our rejection of this worldview. But just as we can appreciate the singular value of this alliance and the peace dividend it's delivered, we have to acknowledge that it remains imperfect. And so we're charged with insisting upon an alliance that remains purpose-built for the times in which we live and the evolving nature of the threats we face. So we can't forget that the one time in NATO's 75-year history that the alliance has invoked Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, was following the September 11th attacks on the United States. So for all of the Sturm und Drang, this turmoil about NATO's relative value, we can't forget that it's delivered in ways indirectly and rather pointedly to shore up US defenses. In so many respects, NATO has functioned as an iron dome of sorts for the United States, offering a missile defense shield, protecting the US from conflict in Europe and bringing a phalanx of supporters to our aid. But like the US, NATO has also miscalculated. That same support for the US pushed NATO into decades of out-of-area campaigns, combat and stabilization alike, as NATO joined US efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan in a variety of ways, and incurred tremendous cost and many casualties in doing so. And as we look at the on-continent threat that NATO faces in Russia with a return to a land war in Europe, it's tempting to question whether things might have been different if NATO had remained focused on Europe. But those are answers that are lost to history. We, the US and NATO, held post-Cold War hopes that relative prosperity would also bring about democracy in China. But I think we see now that that outcome has been quite different. Instead, through unfair trade practices and economic coercion abroad, and political and civil repression at home, the Chinese Communist Party has consolidated wealth and power, which it's now using to undermine the very institutional order that in many respects helped to pull the Chinese people out of poverty and integrate into the global economic system. And while NATO's territory might be physically far removed from China, NATO members recognize that the threats China poses to transatlantic security and prosperity are very real. And this was most clearly manifested in the material and diplomatic support that the PRC is providing to Russia, enabling Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. That's why last summer's summit in Washington was noteworthy, because it was there that we saw the emergence of clear language from NATO about the nature of the Chinese threat in the summit's communique. I quote, "This increases, China, the threat Russia poses to its neighbors and to Euro-Atlantic security. We call on the PRC as a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a particular responsibility to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort. The PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interests and reputation," end quote. That's clear language, and it's language that was achieved through consensus, meaning all 32 nations agreed to it. And it's why NATO's partners in the Indo-Pacific, the so-called IP4, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, have participated in recent NATO summits and information sharing efforts. But unlike NATO's out-of-area forays into the Middle East, its focus on China really is about direct threats to NATO nations. And while NATO members have now reached consensus about the threat that China poses to the alliance, many of their economies at the same time remain rather beholden to Chinese technologies, many signs that de-risking from China in an economic sense is becoming an important and interrelated aspect of defanging its security posture in Europe. But China isn't the only threat facing NATO. The collective cooperation of nations who don't share our values multiplies that threat. Russia and China are joined in this axis of aggressors by Iran and North Korea, two states that are determined to sow chaos and undermine global power and stability. Our adversaries are growing bolder. North Korean troops are joining their Russian counterparts in the war against Ukraine. That was not on my bingo card for last year. And while Beijing and Tehran are increasingly providing Moscow with the material and technology necessary to sustain a war of attrition. That is all happening in this swirl of cooperation. Meanwhile, other nations like India have been critical to Russia's ability to sustain its wartime effort through the dramatic purchases of cheap Russian oil, even as that nation seeks to deepen its relationship with the United States. The growing cooperation amongst all of these actors allows Russia to circumvent Western sanctions and grow its wartime economy. In so doing, they're also undermining international stability and increasing the risks of unleashing war on a global scale. We've also seen an expression of interest from the Chinese in providing peacekeepers in Ukraine. That is, if it can reconcile its economic interests, which hinge on access to cheap Russian oil. So what concessions might China exact for bearing that responsibility? And if not China, who? And what does the energy landscape look like in Ukraine if its ability to receive continued military aid from the United States requires it to forfeit rights to critical minerals, the subject of current negotiations right now? So, like the eras that followed the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War, in 2025, we stand at another inflection point in history. And it's at times like these pivotal moments, that new administrations are also taking office on both sides of the Atlantic. Heard a lot of anxiety expressed about the future of transatlantic relations and a concern that leaders in Washington and Europe have incompatible approaches to international diplomacy. Without a doubt, this is a moment that requires careful but purposeful action. And after a generation of underspending and in some instances neglect, European countries unquestionably need to spend more on their own defense. And the good news is that many are taking this step. In addition to providing considerable support, Europe has and continues to provide to Ukraine. And of the 32 NATO countries and allies, 23 now meet the 2% target, up from just 6 countries in 2021. Though it's also now clear that 3% is the new 2%, given the requirements of the current raft of NATO plans. So just when you thought you were catching up, the dynamics have shifted. Just this week, the leaders of France and the UK were both in Washington to discuss with President Trump the future of European security, including Ukraine. That comes after a small summit of leaders with Macron in Paris. We are living history. As for President Trump, this moment presents him with a chance to cement his place in history as a leader of genuine consequence. But as my colleague and my boss, Atlantic Council President and CEO Fred Kemp, articulated in a recent article, there's no world in which a weaker, more fragmented transatlantic community preoccupied with infighting is in the interest of either the United States or Europe. On the contrary, no relationship is more foundational to shaping the global future. So to the students here, welcome to a career in foreign affairs. It's a messy, complex, interconnected world we've curated just for you. Sorry. It's probably not the world that many of you thought you would enter as you prepare to leave this campus and make your way in the world. And that can be really daunting. But you're also living in a moment of change and disruption, and you can help shape it. And we need your fresh perspectives and insights, because the grown-ups do not have a lock on international peace and security. And this future, it's your future. So strap on your life vests and come on in and help us navigate these treacherous waters, because I do think our ship is sturdy, but the winds are really high and the water is really choppy, and we need a lot of help rigging your sails. Thank you.